Welcome. I am Anna Haskins, and I'm going to start the presentation and Kristin Turney and I have co-authored this presentation in the chapter that follows, but we're part of the section on interdisciplinary perspectives on the consequences of parental incarceration. And in this section, after Kristin and I, are Sarah Wakefield and Robert Appel, and then Julie Pullman and Joyce Arditi. And so they're going to be doing criminological perspectives as well as the developmental and family perspectives. And then after this section, we have a discussion that will be the entire group on each of those pieces. And so we're going to present all together, and then we'll do a discussion at the end for all three. And so we'll hold questions until then, but we've left a good amount of time, about 45 minutes, for that discussion so that you'll be able to ask each group those. And then after that, we'll have a break, and then we will take the picture for all the presenters in that room before we head to lunch. And so that's the first part of this conference. So again, welcome. What's really nice about starting this off is that we can, Kristin and I can sort of set the stage for maybe some of the later presentations. And so what this particular presentation wants to do first is present a demographic landscape of what does this population of incarcerated kids with incarcerated parents look like? And so I will sort of walk us through the parts that we know, and I'll just move forward. So this current demographic landscape of parental incarceration in the United States, trying to cover the race, gender, socioeconomic status, distributions, geographical concentrations, as well as a little bit about the institutional confinement profiles of the parents that are incarcerated. And then I'll end this, my part of this section, talking about the limitations of our knowledge in particular in this, before I pass this on to Kristin, who will summarize our take on the sociological perspectives of parental incarceration and implications for both childhood and adolescent inequality. And we've decided to focus on three particular components in this: heterogeneous relationships, the intergenerational transmission of disadvantage, as well as some evidence on resilience and spillover effects for that. And then Kristin will then talk also, sort of taking a broad picture of looking at the inconsistencies across the research and sort of limitations that continue in the area of sociological and demographic understandings of parental incarceration. All right, so current landscape. Just a little water. Chris mentioned a number in his introduction. He said 1 in 12. I have 1 in 14. That's already an example of sort of our inconsistencies in our broad understanding of how many kids have incarcerated parents. And so there's the numbers that I have gleaned from reports as children with currently incarcerated parents, we have about 2.6 million. So that's about 1 in every 25 minors. And these are all dated, right? So this is as of 2012, we're in 2016. It's harder to sort of get current updated reports. These estimates are offer a little bit more precision because they are, we can glean them from correctional surveys where we ask incarcerated parents, do you have a child? And then they answer those questions. Also, surveying various reports suggests that incarceration has touched at least 5 million children and upwards of 8 million children nationwide. And again, some of these are somewhat dated. And I wanted to intersperse within the slides a few graphs that have been published that try to give numbers here. And so this is from a Brian Sykes and Becky Pettit piece. That shows this is currently incarcerated parents. 1 in 25 children have parents behind bars, and a majority of U.S. prisoners have minor children. Race. So racial disparities are present in broader mass incarceration rates, and they're also reflected in who experience parental incarceration. And so estimates suggest 1 in 4 Black children have an incarcerated parent or have experienced that in their lifetime, 1 in 10 Latinos, and 1 in 25 whites. See what else is. What I wanted to note, I guess there's the other part. What I wanted to note here is sort of national estimates of parental incarceration for Native American, Asian, and Pacific Islander children have never really officially been calculated. And so oftentimes our reports look at white, Black, and Latino because the population sizes are enough to sort of make national estimates. But that's excluding a group of children in terms of racial categorizations that we don't necessarily know much about. And so I tried to look through more sort of state-specific data to sort of figure out what we can say about other groups, other sort of racial groups. And so children, estimates drawn from 2007 Bureau of Justice Statistics reports suggest that when combined, these groups, Native American, Asian, and Pacific Islander children, make up about 5.5% of US resident children with currently incarcerated parents. And then if you look within particular states such as North Dakota or South Dakota and Oklahoma, you can see that there are racial disparities suggesting that Native American children are 2 to 5 times more likely than their white counterparts to have incarcerated parents. So again, we do see racial disparities across many groups, and if you start looking at Native Americans or sort of all non-white groups, then you can, that perspective is there too. Again, just another graph, again, a little bit dated, but you can sort of see these racial disparities in who experiences incarceration, parental incarceration. This is from 2008, but it shows for currently incarcerated parents in prisons, you can see the racial disparities for blacks, whites, and Hispanics, even compared to the average. So parental incarceration is also more likely to occur among children from low socioeconomic status backgrounds. This is measured both in terms of household income as well as parental education. So nationally, children living in poverty, these are incomes below the federal poverty line, are 3 times more likely to experience the incarceration of a resident parent and than their more economically advantaged peers. And the cumulative risk of parental imprisonment among recent cohorts of children from high school dropouts indicates that 15% of white and 62% of African American children will experience this event before their 17th birthday. And so poor children, again, 3 times more likely than their advantaged peers, and then racial disparities, but also these class disparities in the likelihood of experiencing parental incarceration by parental educational attainment. I think what's really interesting to think about too, thinking from a developmental perspective, is this idea of at what age do kids experience parental incarceration? And so the majority of children who experience the incarceration of a parent are young school-aged children between the ages of 4 and 15. And this is often sort of the first time incarceration, and then they may or may not experience subsequent incarcerations after that at later ages. So by age 9, nearly 10% of American children have a resident parent incarcerated. And this is most definitely an underestimate because it's only taking into account children with resident parents. But this is a recent Murphy and Cooper child trends report that just came out that shows sort of this, the modal age of experiencing the incarceration of a resident parent is around age 10, with nearly 10% of children experiencing that. And again, I think this will come up in the limitations slide, but this idea that these are often, all of these estimates are underestimates. They're not overestimates. And so what we see here, if we see these large inequalities and these disparities by race or gender or class or age, are actually exacerbated and larger than we're documenting even here. We really tried to push our knowledge, and so thinking about where. So where do children with incarcerated parents live? What's the sort of the geographical distribution? This is hard, but thanks to Chris. There's a recent paper that he has co-authored with Chris Muller about the geographical variation of parental imprisonment. That came in really handy when we were trying to answer this question as we were writing this chapter. And so this has really shed light on it. It doesn't explain everything, but if you examine the average cumulative risk of experiencing parental incarceration in a state institution, again, this is not jails, and they look across a lot of areas. I've just taken the regional comparisons that they make across 4 regions. They find that the highest risk of children experiencing incarceration happens in the South. The Midwest and West are about in the middle, and then if you're interested in their paper, they give they have numbers that you can rates and that you can look at. And then the lowest likelihood of cumulative risk of experiencing parental incarceration happens in the Northeast. Many surveys that we draw this information from come from urban low-income communities, and so there's also sort of an assumption that parental incarceration, when you think about the geographic distribution, occurs often in urban areas. But there's been some recent work that suggests that there's actually an increased likelihood for children to experience incarceration in more rural, non-metro areas. And so I think our knowledge of that is less, but when we focus our attention on just urban samples, like the fragile families, for example, which I am guilty of just focusing on in terms of my research, we're really, we're underestimating or we're representing a particular group of children and not actually acknowledging that there's incarceration occurring in non-metro areas, often rural, that are missing in there. So thinking about the differences in that geographical distribution. Yeah.
So these analyses are based off of fragile families?
No. Chris, the analyses for the regional differences, the South, Midwest, and West, that area is on, Chris, I mean, you can, it's a cumulative risk. It's
from the survey of inmates in state and federal correctional facilities, they have, in the 2004 data, they have a geographic indicator that it's in the restricted groups.
the Murphy and Cooper Child Trends report is the report that talks about the risk being more likely in rural, non-metro areas. And so this is just my comment about how much of the research that we really focus on has looked at urban areas, and so we know about that population, and then some suggest that that rural non-metro areas are also where we can see an increased likelihood of parental incarceration. Which parent, right? So again, thinking about the children with incarcerated parents, is it the mother, is it the father? There are stark disparities in the gender of the parent incarcerated. Thanks, I'm almost done. 93% are fathers. However, maternal incarceration has increased dramatically over the past 25 years. And so many times work has focused on fathers because the N is the largest to sort of do quantitative analyses on. And there's a lot of really good work on maternal incarceration. Those numbers have increased over time, but it's a relatively small population in comparison. Among resident parents who subsequently experience incarceration, however, 64% are mothers. A smaller portion, but not by much, are fathers, 47%. I think I present this picture first from the Prison Policy Initiative to sort of show these are all the ways, all the types of confinement areas that a person can be confined to. There are state prisons, there are local jails, there are federal prisons, there are juvenile facilities, and if you sort of scan out, there are immigration detention centers, territorial prisons, and then a whole bunch of other things. And so this is to represent that this is the mass of what we look at, but however, we only know the parental confinement profiles from surveys of only a handful of places. So we know state prisons, federal prisons, and to some extent local jails, but not that much. And so the parental confinement profile for prisoners in state prisons, 52% of inmates report having at least one minor child. 63% of inmates within federal prisons are parents. And then parents, and this is drawn from a pretty dated source, but parents account for about 36% of local jail inmate populations. And so, again, I'll quickly talk about the limitations, but we're not hitting the full sort of profile of where parents could be confined within the criminal justice system. We only know statistics from really mainly these sources. And so again, underestimates is sort of the big story too. And then lastly, before we get to that point, I want to talk about why parents are incarcerated again. So the heterogeneity and the type of offense that the parent is incarcerated for. So among parents in federal and state prisons, 2/3 are serving time for nonviolent offenses. 1/4 of those are coming because of nonviolent drug crimes. And then 1/3 were convicted for violent crimes. And so this is drawn from a Pew study that was from 2010 that Bruce Western and Becky Pettit did, showing what sort of the percentage by race as well as by crime for most of the likelihood of parental incarceration, and looking at that. All right, my time is almost up, so I'm going to transition in 1 second. So I want to talk a little bit about the limits of our present knowledge, at least in understanding the scope of parental incarceration. We really need to push for more precise estimates of the reach of parental incarceration in the United States along many lines. And so particularly race ethnicity, we should move in ways beyond black and white to understand that, as well as locational differences. And then in really accounting for the scope of parental incarceration across all correctional facility types is something that we should look to do. And so I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to give Kristin this transition slide. Thank you so much.
I told Anna that I'd be waiting in the wings, so here I am. Hopefully we will do this smoothly. So I just want to talk a little bit about the sociological perspectives on the implications and parental incarceration. And I want to first sort of start out by sort of acknowledging that Holly Foster and John Hagan have a really, really nice review piece in the Annual Review of Sociology. So if you haven't read that piece on sort of sociology's take on parental incarceration and children's outcomes, you should do that. And so they put forth this really nice conceptual framework in which they outline the myriad ways that exclusion results from parental incarceration, and they sort of take an intergenerational, an intersectional, and an interinstitutional approach to this. So in sort of the interest of time, if you haven't read this article, you should do it, because it really sort of outlines both the theories and a lot of the results of empirical studies. So I want to talk first, and probably most importantly, about the theoretical perspectives and the sociological theoretical perspectives underlying research on parental incarceration and children's well-being. So first, people generally propose, sociologists tend to sort of think that the relationship between parental incarceration and children's outcomes is sort of a function of like 1, 2, or 3 of these things. So the first is stigma. So this idea that children of incarcerated parents experience resultant stigma from their fathers or mothers' incarceration, and that this shame sort of impedes their social interactions with others. Second is this idea of separation. So the idea that a father or a mother who is incarcerated is physically removed from the household, and that this trauma and sort of the corresponding loss of a father from the household is consequential for children's well-being. And then the third perspective is this idea of strain, and this idea that the incarceration of a father or a mother creates a strain on the family unit. And usually these strains are considered either like strains on the parental relationship, strains on the family's economic well-being, strains on the mother's or the father's parenting, and strains on health, right? And so that there's all of these, so the incarceration of a parent sort of creates all of these strains on family life, which then in turn leads to worse outcomes for children of incarcerated parents. And so generally, sociologists like to say that the relationship between incarceration and children's outcomes results from one or more of these 3 things. I think I don't have a ton of time to talk about the specifics of the empirical work, so I would direct you sort of immediately to the Foster and Hagan piece. But what I will say is, so I do want to say, generally folks who are sociologists who are studying in this area either look at outcomes in childhood, outcomes in adolescence, or outcomes in young adulthood. And most of the work on childhood, most of the recent work from sociologists on childhood comes from the Fragile Families and Child Wellbeing Study. And research using those data finds that incarceration, parental incarceration, paternal incarceration in particular, is consequential for children's behavioral problems, their cognitive skills, and their health problems. Like Chris said at the outset, the work on maternal incarceration coming from the Fragile Families Study, Chris and I did some work, and we find that the relationship between maternal incarceration and children's outcomes is really heterogeneous. Thinking about sort of moving through adolescence. So adolescence is when children have more interactions with social systems beyond the family unit. And this increases the potential for institutional exclusion for adolescents. So we know from work, most of this work and most of the work on ad health, on adolescence uses ad health data. And so this work sort of looks at the relationship between parental incarceration and health in adolescence and young adulthood, and social exclusion, in political participation, and in criminal justice involvement. So a lot of the work that sociologists have done have been, I'm sure we'll have a discussion at some point today or tomorrow about data limitations. And a lot of the work has come from either the Fragile Families data or the ad health data, and both of those data sets have a lot of strengths, but also have some limitations for studying incarceration. So I'm sure we'll talk about that. How am I doing on time, Chris? Yeah, okay. And other work sort of looks at heterogeneous effects of parental incarceration, although there's less work on this topic. So there's less work that considers how gender, child gender, might moderate the association between parental incarceration and children's outcomes. And the work that does exist is pretty inconsistent. So we see, for example, that among younger children who experience parental incarceration, boys are most affected. But among older children, it seems, at least in terms of like children's health outcomes, girls are more affected. And so there's a lot of inconsistencies, which I think I'm going to just sort of in kind of closing, I just want to sort of suggest a couple of things. It's sort of in the spirit of this interdisciplinary conference, I want to just kind of close by saying, I think the sociological perspective brings a lot to the table. I think that the sociological perspective puts forward these theories of stigma, of separation, and of strain. And I think those are all plausible mechanisms for linking parental incarceration to children's well-being. Another thing that the sociological perspective does really well is it interrogates inequality, right? And so it thinks about, sort of in combination with what Anna has just said about the unequal distribution of incarceration across the population, right? And the fact that we see parental incarceration concentrated among poor children, among minority children, and then we see these negative effects, right? We can then talk about and think about the implications that parental incarceration has for childhood inequality, and then how this inequality might persist across the life course. So sociologists do that really well, I think, and I think we bring that to the table. And analytically, we often rely on large samples, which is great in terms of interrogating heterogeneous effects, right? So we have power to look at differences by race or ethnicity and by gender and by social class or any other things like that. On the other hand, though, sociologists, there are a number of things I think we could improve upon, and I think that's where we really need to look to these other perspectives, the developmental perspectives and the criminological perspectives. Sociologists have gotten really good at trying to estimate an effect of incarceration on children's outcomes and well-being in adolescence and stuff. There's a lot of talk in sociology about the selection into incarceration, which is, of course, really important. I don't want to suggest it's not. But we also can't do much about that, right? Because we can't randomly assign kids to incarcerated parents. So we talk a lot about selection, but we have a difficult time sort of implementing that. And so I guess I would like to push sociologists to think a little bit more about other ways we can contribute besides, so moving forward a little bit in terms of thinking about, at what point in the life course of children are effects most detrimental? What are the mechanisms that link parental incarceration to children's outcomes? I think that's really important. And I think sociologists could be better about using our theories, right? The stigma, the separation, and the strain. But we often can't adjudicate between those theories, right? So our data oftentimes doesn't allow us to adjudicate between those theories. And so I think we could do a better job of building theory and using these interdisciplinary perspectives to build theory, and which might shed light on why, not only what explains the link between parental incarceration and children's outcomes, but also one thing I didn't really have time to get into here, and we talk about it a little bit more in the paper, but a really close reading of this literature suggests really inconsistent results. And so if you really read the literature closely, not all studies find that parental incarceration is uniformly bad for kids, right? So it kind of depends on the outcome, and it depends on when parental incarceration is measured, and it depends on whether it's maternal incarceration or paternal incarceration. And so I guess I would like to push us to use these sociological perspectives, but also use perspectives from other disciplines as well to really try to build theory a little bit better in terms of reconciling inconsistent findings and thinking a little bit more comprehensively about why we might see inconsistent findings and how we might be able to explain those and sort of build theory in that way. So I'll close there. Thanks for listening, and I'll look forward to the other interdisciplinary perspectives too. Thanks.